What would it cost to deport roughly 11 million illegal immigrants from the US? I actually did the math on this, and the numbers are pretty shocking. So shocking, I actually hired a researcher to double check because I didn't think the numbers were right. If you want to check my math, the spreadsheets are available at ryanbeth.substack.com for free. I am no expert in immigration, but I am pretty good at math, facts, and numbers. I found this to be an incredibly complex topic, complete with scales and histories that are mind-boggling. I am not too into politics, so here's my rules of engagement on this topic, and there's really only two of them here. So number one, just the facts, no politics. Number two, sources are cited, found on Substack. Before we jump into this, let me talk about ground news. The Trump administration is running out of planes for deportation purposes, at least as of January 26, 2025, the day that I am filming this. I learned that on ground news, specifically the blind spot report. Let me show you this. Most news outlets covering this event have been right-wing. I am a centrist. I totally missed this story. If you're on the left wing, you wouldn't have even seen this story at all because your news organization didn't even report it. This blind spot report is really useful, and you get it every single day with ground news. Ground news is a news aggregator. It not only gives you the factuality rating of your news source, but also who owns it, so you can figure out who is telling you what to think. I pay for ground news myself. They do not give it to me for free. I even got a subscription for my dad, who's 86 years old and sits around watching CNN all day, becoming more and more misinformed. This is a crucial tool, not only for you, but for that family member who really, really needs it. So go to ground.news/Ryan, get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I own and I got my dad. So now let's keep talking about deportations. This video will discuss the following. What are the illegal immigration numbers? How did we get here? What will it cost to handle this colossal problem? And what happens next? Like I said before, all the sources are at ryanbeth.substack.com for free. By the way, you paid Substack subscribers are what keeps this channel going, so thank you guys for this. Unless you're a Native American, and Native Americans were colloquially and incorrectly called Indians until fairly recently, you're an immigrant too, right? We are a nation of immigrants, to use the old phrase. My family came from Northern Ireland. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, which has the largest population of Ethiopians, like outside of Ethiopia. But the very definition of a country is its borders. It's how we say, okay, this is where your laws stop and our laws start. Now, the scale of the problem is something we often overlook. In American politics, both sides of the political spectrum have ignored the realities of this issue. Many think tanks and government organizations appear to agree that America's illegal immigration numbers hover around 11 million, maybe 13 million. And if we look at the extreme views, some places number as high as 30 million, although no evidence really appears to support this. So for our purposes, I'll stick with around 11 million illegal immigrants involved here. The math can always change by changing some numbers in the spreadsheet. Illegal immigrants living in the United States comprise close to 5 times the population of New Mexico. The states with the highest levels of legal immigrant populations are California, Texas, and Florida, which also have some of the strongest and largest economies in the United States. So you might be wondering, how did we get here? It's a long story, man. Now, to understand the issues behind the immigration crisis, we have to go way back and examine American history, and specifically Prohibition. America's flirtation with national prohibitions is nothing new, and it was one of the leading causes of our nation's illegal immigration crisis. Now, during the 1880s, America experienced this massive influx of immigration from Ireland, Germany, Eastern Europe, and Italy. And a good portion of these immigrants brought their drinking habits with them, much to the anger of Anglo-American Protestants. Rum, Romanism, and rebellion became sort of this racist dog whistle against alcohol-drinking immigrants by upstanding teetotalers. By 1915, Maine, Kansas, North Dakota, Georgia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia all had passed laws either banning or restricting the sale of alcohol. And that worked because many Irish, German, and Italian immigrants who enjoyed a drink now and then had settled in big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. None of those cities were in Prohibition states before the passing of the 18th Amendment. So the whole Prohibition thing may have been a case of pearl clutching or politicians pandering to their base. Some things never change. By 1920, there was enough public support for prohibition to pass the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale of alcohol in the United States, with exceptions made for religious wine and medicinal whiskey. By the way, if you've ever shopped at Walgreens, they grew from 20 drugstores in 1919 to over 525 stores by 1929, mainly by filling whiskey prescriptions during Prohibition. The American sport of NASCAR, the stock car racing came out of the Prohibition era, where moonshiners who made illegal liquor used fast cars to outrun the police while getting their products to market. So I guess this only goes to show you that if you prohibit something and there's a demand for it, people are going to go to great lengths to get it. And that's where the gangsters and organized crime comes in. We've all heard of the 1920 Chicago-era gangsters smuggling Canadian whiskey into America, but not many people know about the tequileros. Tequileros uses horses and mules to bring bottles of tequila from Mexico into Texas, where it would command a much higher price. Sometimes they were caught by customs officials, or they got into shootouts with the Texas Rangers, and their exploits were turned into romantic ballads called corridos. It was the forerunner of the modern drug cartel narco corrido. Now, by 1924, the situation on the American borders had really gotten out of hand. Smuggling was rampant, coming from Mexico and Canada. The same people who wanted liquor banned turned to a new kind of moral panic to ignite their base: immigrants. The purpose of propaganda isn't to speak the truth or create some kind of intellectual argument. It's designed to spread appeal down to the basest of human emotions, even if it's logically suspect. That person is the other. That is the source of your problems. The other, real or imagined. Now, the Immigration Act of 1924 created an immigration quota of 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 National Census. It also completely excluded immigrants from Asia coming into the U.S., specifically Japan and China, over fears of a yellow invasion. And yeah, that's what they worded it. The act also created the U.S. Border Patrol. And while they were technically supposed to enforce immigration laws, they found themselves dealing mainly with alcohol smuggling on the borders of Mexico and Canada. Creating a new bureaucracy to deal with a problem is as American as apple pie, because any kind of immigration reform that reduces the need for enforcement might be popular with people, but it won't be so popular with legislators. Politicians need a way to reward people who help them get elected, and this is why political patronage jobs exist. If the problem is illegal immigration and you create a border patrol, you just created hundreds of new jobs that need political appointees, and the winning party appoints those appointees. By World War II, the country was stuck in a serious farm labor shortage. Every young, able-bodied man was either signing up to fight or being drafted, and the U.S. needed a way to produce food for the war effort. That's where the Bracero program was ushered in. Men from Mexico could work farms in places like Texas, Arizona, California with a guaranteed minimum wage and good working conditions. By the 1960s, concern over working conditions, opposition from farm labor union activists such as Cesar Chavez, and rapid mechanization led to the ending of the Bracero program in 1964. By 1970, unemployment in Mexico was hovering at around 7%. If you're a young man, why not head north and work as unskilled farm labor? You can send money home, at least until you get caught. And if you get caught, you just get deported. No big deal. You can always come back. The border was really porous at the time. It wasn't that well enforced. And in many ways, border security kind of became a literal punchline for a joke. Remember that scene in that Cheech and Chong movie, Up in Smoke, where a Mexican family in LA gets themselves deported because they need a ride to a wedding in Mexico? It's a funny scene, but it reflects the sort of wink and a nod that many Americans felt about the Mexican border, especially farmers who needed cheap labor. Americans claimed they wanted border security, but they also wanted cheap strawberries. You know another thing Americans wanted? Drugs. Americans love to do drugs. Marijuana was illegal in America, and Mexico just so happened to have the right climate conditions to grow cannabis. It also just happened to be right next to the United States. With prohibition comes gangsters and smugglers, no different than the 1920s. Marijuana is heavy and bulky. It smells. It's easy to detect. A kilo of cannabis could be sold in the 1980s for between $1,400 to $1,800. You'd have to move a lot of cannabis to make any money. Now, cocaine in the 1980s changed all that. A brick of cocaine could be sold for about $50,000. This means you'd have to transport 33 kilos of cannabis, or roughly the weight of a queen-size mattress, in order to make the same profit as 1 kilo of cocaine. What would you distribute if you were a drug smuggler? I mean, you would distribute the smallest item that you could make the most amount of profit on, right? And in the 1980s and 90s, it was cocaine. Criminal cartels started forming in Mexico, which controlled the routes for moving drugs into the U.S. While this was going on, Central America was a hotbed of revolutionary insurgencies. The Soviet Union was funding revolutionaries in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Peru during the 1970s and 1980s. And if Russia funded the communists, America funded the anti-communists and the dictators of South America, who kind of kept a lid on communism with an iron fist. Into this mix, we introduced the money from drug production and transportation. You know, sometimes a person wins the lottery and they just go crazy? Well, that was Central and South America in the 1980s. America and the Soviet Union and drug cartels were bringing in money and guns. The drug cartels are often the revolutionaries using drug sales to fund anti-government operations. El Salvador had been dealing with left-wing communist-supported insurgencies for years, and you can kind of understand why. El Salvador's main export was coffee, and most of the land was owned by like 2% of the population. If you were a peasant farmer and some Cuban revolutionary showed up inside El Salvador with some guns and an ideology about a classless society, that might sound pretty darn good. A coup plunged the country into civil war that pitted American-supported right-wing anti-communist leaders against left-wing Cuban and Soviet-sponsored revolutionaries. These El Salvadoran refugees flooded into America, and we let them in. Some settled in Los Angeles and formed gangs to protect themselves from other established gangs in the area. This was the advent of the infamous criminal gang MS-13. When the El Salvadoran Civil War was finally over, refugees who were convicted of crimes were sent back to El Salvador, where they promptly started gangs and would drag the country back into chaos again. Now, by 1986, the United States was facing a major immigration crisis. People from Central and South America were fleeing war and poverty. Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and President Reagan signed into law on November 6, 1986. This law provided amnesty to certain undocumented immigrants who had been continuously present in the United States before January 1, 1982. The law also created the I-9 form for employee eligibility verification. This meant that in America, when you applied for a job, you had to prove your eligibility to work with a birth certificate or a Social Security card. Now, for my foreign viewers, America has no national ID card. The most common form of identification in America is issued by the individual states, the driver's license. That's right. The organization responsible for determining your identity is the one most concerned about whether or not you know when it's legal to make a left turn. Now, by the 1980s and 90s, an idea began kicking around North American economic circles for a free trade agreement between America, Canada, and Mexico. And these three countries were already huge trading partners with each other. Why not make it easier? And they called this NAFTA. In 1992, independent presidential candidate H. Ross Perot claimed in a debate that there would be a giant sucking sound of American jobs going south to Mexico if NAFTA passed due to lower wages and environmental regulations in Mexico. Well, Bill Clinton was elected president, and he signed NAFTA into law on December 8, 1993. Incidentally, H. Ross Perot's vision proved prophetic. My dad managed a warehouse for a factory that made women's dresses, and he lost his job a few months later. I still wanted to go to college for computers, but we had no money, which is why I joined the military. NAFTA was supposed to make Mexico rich enough to incentivize people to stay at home. But American agribusiness is really good at growing things, and the Mexican farmers just couldn't compete. So these Mexican farmers went north. Add into this the fact that cartels really don't care where they get their money. If you have a brick of cocaine, you have to get that product not only over the border, but to a city where you have to eventually sell it. But if you smuggle a person, well, by the time they're in the U.S., you already have their money. So why wouldn't you choose to smuggle a person instead of drugs? At least you don't have to carry the people, and the smuggling routes all still work. So there was a motivation on the cartel side to get into the people smuggling business as opposed to the drug business. Now, the root causes that I covered today are just a few contributing to the large-scale problem that is illegal immigration into the United States. So what would it cost to handle this very serious problem, politics aside? If we were to take Immigration and Customs Enforcement stats on arrests, it costs around $6,736.87 just to arrest somebody. That doesn't include detention, trial, and deportation. That is just arrest. So to arrest all 11 million or so illegal immigrants in the U.S., just arrest, it will cost $74,280,728,620. This is assuming a 100% capture rate, which is unusual in all circumstances. Again, this is just the arrests. So what happens after the arrests? Well, then we have to detain these individuals somehow, right? This is where the scale becomes an absolute nightmare. How long are these folks detained? Is it 3 days, 15 days, a month, 6 months, a year? Note that I have put together some dollar amounts in a Google sheet that I'm sharing with my Substack followers. It breaks down the estimated number of illegal immigrants per state with an additional examination of the numbers in dollar cost per state arrest, detention, trial, and deportation. These are rosy estimates, and they can't account for everything, and it is pretty darned eye-opening. All right, so back to what happens after arrest. It's detention, right? Detention per ICE statistics it's spread across a lot of government paper. And it shows that the cost of detaining a single individual runs about $236 per day. Families cost more. Medically needy people cost more. And I'm sure violent offenders, if they're captured, they will cost more as well. If new detention facilities are built and have to be built in a hurry. So more than likely, old military bases, maybe decommissioned federal facilities would need to be retrofitted to accommodate these individuals so this can be ramped up fast without having to build new facilities. So we might not have to build any new infrastructure. But once the illegal immigrants have been detained, the clock starts running. They will need to go through a trial process so they can legally be deported, something that will require thousands of judges, a whole cadre of legal workers and support officials, as well as other human infrastructure like medical care, psychological care, janitors, laundry, and maintenance men. The costs just keep piling on. We need to feed these detained individuals. We need to keep them under surveillance. We need to keep them healthy. We need to keep them safe, and so much more. It is a problem that even if you look at it hard enough, it doesn't get easier to solve. Trials for those arrested and detained would be another logistical nightmare. If we were Russia or China, this would be something else entirely. But in our country, everyone, and that means everyone, including illegal immigrants, including violent gangbangers, everyone gets a fair trial. That means judges, legal workers, courtroom janitors, technology support technicians, interpreters, and more would be required to take this task on. The cost for these trials would be enormous too, in terms of the number of people being fed through the system, which comes at a per individual cost of roughly $2,000 per person tried. This mass-scale deportation operation would require a considerable number of guards and facilities staff, so ICE would likely need a considerable budget, and ICE's recent $9 billion budget suggested it is not up to this task at all. They would need more money. Then we have deportation, which is the final stage of this process. The average cost of deportation has been estimated by the American Immigration Council will be in the ballpark of about $1,500 per person. It adds another layer of complexity to this massive undertaking. In terms of scale, cost, and disruption, we're looking at one of the largest mass migrations of people in human history. So at an absolute minimum, if we hold every illegal immigrant for the minimum amount of time, meaning like day one, you arrest them and then process them. Day two, they have a trial. And then by day three, they're either released or they're on a plane back to where they came from. That would take 3 days. That's the minimum. So the best case scenario, this works out to $74.3 billion to arrest, $7.8 billion to detain, $16.3 billion for trial, and $16.1 billion for deportation, for a total of $114 billion. That is just the best case scenario. We hold every illegal immigrant for 3 days. A more likely scenario would be 30 days. That would cost $74.3 billion to arrest, $78.2 billion to detain, $16.4 billion for trial, and $16.1 billion for deportation, which would be $185 billion. This is roughly the mandatory spending budget of the Department of Housing and Urban Development for the next 10 years. The absolute worst case scenario for holding everybody would be like a year. This would mean $74.3 billion to arrest, $951 billion to detain, $16.4 billion for trial, and $16.1 billion for deportation, for a total of $1.058 trillion, or approximately the yearly budget of the Social Security program in America. Now, I don't think that every trial will take a year, and this is the absolute worst case scenario, but you need a clickbaity thumbnail with me going, right? The more likely scenario is that some people would take 3 days, like violent offenders. In some cases, families might take 30 days. And then there would be a couple of outliers that could take a year. So either way, once an illegal immigrant is arrested, the clock is ticking. So they either need to be released or deported as soon as possible because the costs go up really quick. And this doesn't factor into the equation the economic disruption from removing 11 million people from the American economy. People who are, doing something illegal, but they are working, they are paying sales taxes and gas taxes and buying groceries and so on. So there is an economic effect, and the U.S. needs to be prepared for that, although I'm not entirely sure what we need to do. So where do we go from here? Now, if history or even recent events are any indication of what will come next, we might want to worry about this a little bit more. Historically, the United States has prided itself on being a nation of immigrants. However, we have been painfully slow and inept when it comes to our immigration policies concerning legal entry and enforcement. While arresting 11 million people probably isn't something that is economically or even politically feasible, something has to happen. We have to know who the hell is in this country. So maybe it could look like this. Step one, we close the border to illegal immigration and deport people immediately when caught. I mean, the number one rule of wound management is to stop the freaking bleeding. Number two, we deport violent offenders when caught. This is a no-brainer. And number three, we figure out what the heck to do with the millions of illegal immigrants who remain. Now, number three might sound a lot like amnesty. And you might be saying, why are we giving amnesty to people who broke the law? I mean, dude, I got two options here. One that costs $185 billion and the other one's free. $185 billion could buy 84 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers for the U.S. Navy, and I'm a hell of a lot more worried about China's naval shipbuilding capability than I am dudes who stand outside of Home Depot. So yeah, we need to get rid of the violent offenders, but we may need to think about where this money is going. So this one's on you, America. Numbers are solid. How much does it mean to you to get rid of every single illegal immigrant? Because you can do it for a cost. And if we are going to do it, it would be in our best interest to keep detention time as low as possible, because that's the variable cost that can go up with time. So that's the question. We need to focus on as a country. We need to ensure that immigration is safe and legal and less of a mind-boggling crisis. And hey, if you want to support the channel, pick up my copy of The Wind Machine. It's about a mind-boggling crisis where a hedge fund manager with an AI-powered supercomputer discovers a possible limited nuclear exchange with China and what he does with that information. You can also head over to Bunker Brand to get one of my Intel Life t-shirts. And I think we still have patches. The Alcoholics Moving Cargo patches that you can kind of slap on your uniform until you get caught. A little tribute to the Air Mobility Command. And thank you guys so much for watching.
Wow, this girl from Watertown sure is cool. Hey kid, what's going on? Think tank! A girl from Watertown is kind of like riding a moped. It's lots of fun till your friends see you on one. What's really cool is a t-shirt or hoodie from Bunker Branding. Wow! Intel Life! Control-C, Control-V! That's exactly what we do! And Bunker Branding has all sorts of cool gear. Intel Life, Aerosol, Live, Laugh, Launch for Destroyer, Trident, HIMARS, and Patriot. Think outside the bomb. Drone Sweep Drone. Department of the Boat People. Landmines. and even the tow missile. It would behoove you to grab one today. Girls from Watertown aren't cool, so wear your bunker branding gear. Now I know, and knowing's half the battle. Hey babe, you wanna dance? Bunker branding.